Well, ladies and gentlemen, I want to begin with two personal declarations. First of all, I have to tell you, I'm not Scottish. I'm not English. I'm Welsh. My mother was Welsh. I was born in Wales. Therefore, I am Welsh. I'm part of this oppressed linguist minority. Sometimes when I worked in Brussels, people asked me these questions about my identity working in an international organization. And I used to say, my nationality is Welsh, my passport is British, and my citizenship is European. And these three things, they're not contradictory, they're mutually reinforcing. So that was my first declaration. Secondly, as has been mentioned, I worked for many years in the European Commission. I was a very junior member of the British team negotiating British membership, and subsequently I was involved in one way or another in all the enlargements, including Spain. So if there's one subject on which I'm an expert, it's how to join the European Union. But I want to underline here, I'm not speaking for the European Commission, my former employer. What I'm saying today is what I think, not what they think I should think. So I want to explain that my contribution to this debate arises from the fact that sometime in the summer of last year, I became quite irritated with what I was hearing and reading from the unionists in London, who in the debate on Scottish independence used the argument that the European Union, membership of the European Union, would be another big problem for an independent Scotland, and that Scotland would have to leave the European Union, then reapply for membership like Turkey or any other country. And this seemed to me such a poor argument that I submitted a paper to the British House of Commons in which I'll outline the arguments, which were that, first of all, the arrangement for Scotland to be a member of the European Union should come into force and be in place simultaneously with its independence. Secondly, that the 5 million people of Scotland who've been members of the European Union for 40 years have acquired rights as European citizens. For practical and political reasons, they couldn't be asked to leave the European Union and apply for readmission. And it follows that the negotiations on the conditions of membership for Scotland would need to take place in the period between the referendum and the planned date of independence. And as far as the procedure for these negotiations is concerned, my argument is that the European Union would follow a simplified procedure, not the traditional procedure, so-called Article 49 of the treaty, which is followed for the accession of non-member countries. I'm not going to go into any more details about the paper that I published. You'll find it on the internet. But I just want to underline, from the practical point of view, for Scotland to leave the European Union and then rejoin would require extremely complicated temporary arrangements for a new relationship between the European Union, including the United Kingdom and Scotland, including the possibility even of controls at the frontier between England and Scotland. Neither the European Union, nor the rest of the United Kingdom, nor Spain would have an interest in creating such an anomaly. And secondly, from the political point of view, as I said before, it seems to me that the people of Scotland have acquired certain rights. And this solution to the question of Scottish membership is sometimes, I call it sometimes, the common sense solution. I'm not a lawyer, and of course one of the problems we have in this Scottish case is that the European treaties don't provide for the case which we're looking at, the independence of part of a member state. There are some historical precedents. They're not direct precedents, but there's some experience. People sometimes forget that an important part of France, Algeria, was originally in the European community, but then they separated. It's not a direct precedent because Algeria didn't want to remain in the European communities, but nevertheless, it's a question. Since then, as you know, there have been the cases of Greenland, which joined the European communities with Denmark and then got self-government and became independent. Another interesting precedent is the case of East Germany. The German Democratic Republic joined the European Union effectively by joining the German Federal Republic. This was a case of enlargement without accession, quite opposite from the case of Scotland, which would be a case of accession without enlargement. Nevertheless, I think the German case is interesting because under the pressure of time, the deadline for German reunification, the EU, the Brussels system, found a way to rapidly solve the problems so that 20 million Germans could join on the appointed date. So let me turn to the wider situation of the European Union. In general, on these kind of constitutional, institutional questions, the institutions of the European Union, they prefer member states to find solutions. They're not keen to intervene. The European Commission, for example, always tries to be very prudent in these discussions, and it's trying to keep out of the debate with Scotland. The President of the Commission, José Manuel Barroso, has said that it's not the role of the Commission to express a position on questions of internal organization related to the constitutional arrangements of a particular member state. He went on to say, which has been subject to some other interpretations, he said a new independent state would, by the fact of its independence, become a third country with respect to the European Union, and the treaties would no longer apply on its territory. And this remark by President Barroso has been interpreted to exclude what I call the common sense solution. But I think I'll leave it to David Edward as a lawyer to comment further on that. Anyhow, I think you can imagine that both the Commission and the other institutions would try to stay out of the debate. In any case, although the Commission is the guardian of the treaties, it doesn't have the lead role in these constitutional questions, and certainly not in the case of accession to the European Union, which is a strictly intergovernmental matter. Of course, in the case of Scotland, if the Scottish people say yes, there would need to be unanimity among the member states to find what I call a common sense solution. And there's a question mark about the position that Spain and Madrid would take in such a scenario. I'm not going to comment on that, except that it seems to me it would be a case where there will be a certain tension between reason on the one hand and passion on the other hand. Anyway, all I want to say is that having listened carefully this morning to Javier Vidal-Folch, I want to say that he was absolutely right to argue, to remind us that Catalonia is not Scotland and Spain is not the United Kingdom. We have found here a procedure to solve this Scottish question, a procedure which is democratic, it's in accordance with our constitution. Fortunately, we in this country don't have a written constitution, so the constitutional dimension is easier to solve. In general, I have to say, I don't agree with everything that the present British government does, particularly on European policy, and I'll come to that in a moment. But on this question of handling the Scottish question, personally, I think it is honourable, and I'm glad to be a citizen of a member state that found such a reasonable solution. Concerning the European policy of the British government, I'm not going to say too much, but I'm going to remind you that the debate on Scottish independence takes place against the background of another debate about British membership of the European Union. There may be a referendum, perhaps in 4 years' time, on the United Kingdom's membership of the European Union. And the debate on Scotland and the debate on the European Union have certain similarities. They're both debates about membership of a union. I limit myself to saying that attitudes to the European Union are different in Scotland and in Wales than in England. In general, in Scotland and Wales, the people are more in favour of the European Union. So you could imagine at the extreme a final result in which the voters of England said no to the European Union, while the voters of Scotland and Wales said yes. And this would be a scenario, unlikely but possible, in which there would be, I think, a real constitutional crisis in this country. Let me come back to the question of Catalonia. The scenario for Scotland, as I said, is different from Catalonia. If the Scottish people say yes, the British government has already promised that it will respect that decision and implement it honourably. And that, for me, implies that London would help Edinburgh to join the European Union without difficulty. I think the other member states would also cooperate in a process which would be conducted democratically and in accordance with the constitutional arrangements of the member state concerned. For you in Catalonia, the situation is less clear. After a referendum in Catalonia, unless there was the agreement of the rest of Spain to cooperate, it would be very difficult to see an outcome which would be easy to handle with the European Union. I'm going to finish by saying it's not for us British to tell you Spanish or you Catalans what to do. The best we can do, I think, is to explain how we've handled the situation here and to advise you to talk. More than one speaker, Professor Montserrat just now, underlined the importance of dialogue. And I think that's a fundamental thing that you need to concentrate on. It's for you to find a solution. The European Union and none of the member states can find it for you. But I want to remind you that the European Union is a project of reconciliation. It had its origins after the Second War in Franco-German reconciliation, and it's been a movement for peace and reconciliation ever since. And I'm absolutely convinced that in the case of Catalonia and in the case of Scotland, the European Union should not be an obstacle to progress, but should help you to find an environment in which your problems can be solved. Thank you.